You are all most welcome to Áras and Uachtaráin for this national seminar as we draw together and reflect on the various outcomes from the many events which made up the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative. I suppose I should emphasise that it isn't the end of anything. It is a punctuation point in relation to the President's reflection, because so many, as you will hear during the day, of the fruits that have already borne, the seeds that have already borne fruit are already underway, and they will continue. That's very, very important, as indeed my own consideration. I have one other preliminary point to make, which is that this consideration has been located, if you like, on the island of Ireland and how the island of Ireland relates to communities and societies beyond. But I was aware of something else, of the difficulties of a consideration like this. There is putting in the difficulty already. Well, Confucius said once, I think, that the man of virtue makes the difficulty to be overcome his first business, and success only a following consideration. Now, I think that considering ethics internationally is an extraordinary difficult task. World leaders tend to do it after they have left office. And thus, in December of last year, the very famous Interaction Council, which was founded in 1983, and is really, as Malcolm Fraser, who obituary I saw today in the paper, and he and others such as Yasuo Fukuda, they ran a whole series of considerations on could you have a universal ethic or a global ethic. And curiously too, they regarded Hans Kuhn's own project, which was in relation to, is there a possibility of a universal ethic from the major religions, which Hans Kuhn ran under the slogan, no peace among the nations until peace among the religions, and so forth. The religious consideration was regarded, I know, by Helmut Schmidt as having made very much more progress than the other particular consideration. But today we're at home, and we're dealing with not only what should be, but what might be, and as we say in Irish, an rud is féidir, and what can be. And in that sense, you're all very welcome to Áras and Uachtaráin for this national seminar as we draw together the various outcomes of the many events which made up the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative. I want to say, first of all, that this should be a most cheerful day. I don't think I've ever had such a largely representative group of people who are doing good things, and things of belief and things of practice and things of solidarity in a single room for such a long time. We were limited to 130. We were overwhelmed with applications of people who wished to attend. So there is, if you like, a demanding consciousness for an ethical life. It was designed by me as an invitation to the Irish people to engage in a national conversation about ethics. It began, as you have seen, with an appeal I made to Irish third-level institutions, really because I saw the greatest capacity in the beginning in terms of facilities and so on, but also to community and advocacy group, to embrace the challenge of discussing the principles and values by which we might live together as a society. In the wake of a crisis that starkly requires us to interrogate our vision of what is the social bond, what are social bonds and human relations, and our conception of what we define as security, prosperity, the good life, sufficiency, which was one of the themes I dealt with during the year. As president of a society which has been affected acutely by the recent global financial meltdown, I consider it crucial that we collectively reflect on the structural and indeed the moral and philosophical questions that are raised by this most recent crisis in order that we might learn from the experience. It would be such a waste of time to drift on past not understanding it or seeking to understand it, or wondering rather like as if it was a dark cloud that it has gone away. We need to do more than that, and that is what this exercise was about. And in bringing forward this initiative, my starting point was that it is not possible to change our economics or politics without addressing the values and assumptions that underpin them. I have to emphasize in such a well-endowed intellectual gathering to say, I respect these subjects and every instrument of thought that is contained within them. Every, for example, in economics, econometrics, or whatever. But I do think it is necessary in good intellectual, honest work to state one's assumptions and let those assumptions be free to be questioned. That such a change is necessary has been acknowledged at the global level by many eminent scholars, far more eminent than I. Kaushik Basu of Cornell, for example, currently chief economic advisor to the Minister for Finance in India and Vice President of the World Bank. He is among them, and in his seminal book, Beyond the Invisible Hand, Professor Basu wrote of his rejection of the norms that prevailed in the Bengali household of his childhood, where people would lower their voices when they were speaking of commerce. And he said the importance of norms, to think of such norms and shared beliefs, and the social pressures that they place on individuals as trivial or inconsequential to the functioning of the market would be a great mistake. On the other hand, taking account of those properly is an extremely difficult job. Of course, I should say, to note as we go along, in his wonderful book, Beyond the Invisible Hand, he offered us an alarming but very important concept, the concept of the invisible fist. And indeed, there's something in that. Examining the underlying values behind failed policies is difficult. In an Irish context, we might ask, for example, how has property ownership and the individualism to which it gave rise influenced our views on the ethical quality or the social equity of policy? Across Ireland, there are many such conversations, as you've heard, conversations that interrogate our values and our assumptions and explore the means by which we might transform our society and the world around us. And to a certain extent, these conversations are informed, as I have found out and experienced, by a real anxiety. They are sometimes inchoate, but they are producing a profusion of ideas, projects, activities that suggest avenues for change, directions to a new place. And by inviting all those interested to take part in the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative, my purpose was to give recognition to these many positive endeavours in their various ways, in different places, at different levels underway. It was to provide a possible framework and a catalyst to those already engaged in crafting more solid foundations for our shared present and future, and to inspire perhaps new activities, new collaborations, let me say it, new opportunities for a shared joy. Many of you who are here today, you've been directly involved in that ethics initiative through your participation in events hosted by universities, civic society organizations, or held in the community. Others have written to me directly, expressing a personal interest in the initiative and outlining your own views on the challenges of living together ethically at the beginning of the 21st century. To all of you, I want to convey my sincere appreciation for helping to make this President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative such a vibrant and rich experience over the past year, and for coming along today on one of our fine spring Saturdays to continue the discussion with me and with each other. And I assure you again, it is not the end of anything, but rather the pause for several new departures beyond my initiative. When I was elected as president, I committed to shape my presidency as one of ideas and transformation. In the inaugural address, November the 11th, 2011, I said, "It is necessary to move past the assumptions which have failed us and to work together for such a different set of values as will enable us to build a sustainable social economy and a society which is profoundly ethical and inclusive. A society and a state which will restore trust and confidence at home and act as a worthy symbol of Irishness abroad, inviting relationships of respect and cooperation across the world. That is the version of Ireland that people might encounter and might in fact last and might in fact be exemplary. So different from, as it were, seeking to imitate something, to convince ourselves of some achievement in imitation. The wealth of conversations and encounters that I had, for example, during the long presidential election campaign, and the numerous visits I made since taking office to so many villages, towns, and cities across Ireland, as well as to so many foreign countries, including countries where Irish Aid is active, they've only strengthened my conviction that there is a groundswell of popular demand for a fundamental re-examination of the assumptions and values that underpin the dominant economic and political discourse of our times. Ethics, it offers a conceptual language, I suggest, that is useful. I suggest in capturing these diffuse demands and in connecting ongoing discussions about dignity, that concept that goes across all the faith systems is present in most of the human rights charters. Human rights itself, education in the fullness of the person, or education for utility, quality of life, and social and community values, living in the shadow and care of each other, all of which are perceived as being neglected, frankly, in the mainstream public discourse, a kind of frenetic assembly of reactions rather than thoughtful reflection. At a moment of great loss, when trusted institutions have failed the citizenry, when institutions and professional bodies have let the citizens down, when the fallacies at the heart of established and dominant modes of thinking are exposed, and when values of social responsibility are shown to have been neglected or even abandoned altogether, cast aside temporarily or even for good. On a grand scale, it might be tempting to respond to the question, is it possible to live ethically in the contemporary world with despondency, fatalism, and even cynicism? And at the beginning, that was the question frequently put to me. And I said to the participants, not just to frighten them, it may be your conclusion that it is not possible to live ethically. And then you have to move quickly on to the why of your answer. It would be easy, too, to diagnose the cause of our difficulties as being merely rooted in something like the failures of compliance. Yes, they were there. Individual failures and misdeeds, which could be simply named and punished, and then we could go on as before. Indeed, it's not enough to say, for example, that the upheavals caused by an unprecedented banking collapse and property bubble could be fixed if the rights of provision and regulatory mechanism are put in place. But is this to say that you want to have the problem all over again? As I emphasized in my first speech dealing explicitly with the topic of ethics in September 2013, I quote, "The proliferation of ethical manuals and codes of conduct in the various professional sectors will be of only limited consequence if we do not also ensure that their purpose is embraced and understood by, and not just enforced upon those for whom they are designed." At its lowest level, of course, the protocol is making sure you are seen, in fact, not to be caught. In another case, it is to comply. But as to why you have the protocol is, I suggest, the bigger question. The current crisis has moral and intellectual ramifications that run very deep. It calls for an interrogation of our vision of what it is to be human and the conception of human relations that animate us as a society. The risk, as I see it, is that if we do not tackle the assumptions that have inflicted such deep injuries on our moral imaginations, we will resile to a position of business as usual. We must not then miss this opportunity to seek together a new set of principles by which we might live ethically in society. In that regard, I'm happy to observe that the Irish people's response to the economic crisis has not been, in my view, one of fatalism or simplistic solutions. Beyond issues of accountability, and notwithstanding divergent views on specific policy questions, Irish citizens have collectively shown a deep desire to examine the root causes of what has happened and to reconnect what has been sundered in our society and in our public discourse. There is, for example, all of the things they have done together in the public realm, the community gardens they make together, and discover again the opportunity of being able to speak to each other with care. This radical demand stems from a growing frustration with existing institutions and the dominant, mostly unstated ideologies which have contributed to the economic and political meltdown of recent years. It carries, hopefully, too, a constructive willingness to think and act in different ways, even if the pathway for thought and action is not yet defined, part of our task. But it must be fashioned through enduring intellectual work and social action. The contemporary moment is defined by challenges which established modes of thinking and aversion in politics are ill-equipped to meet, and the nature and scale of which demand a radical rethinking of how we live and how we organize our national and international systems of governance. This means that it is not only possible to live ethically in our contemporary world, but it is in fact imperative that we re-engage with ethics if we are to survive and flourish and meet these great challenges of our time. There is a need to revive political economy, to reconnect economic thinking to its ethical foundations. We should never forget, as I have already alluded, to the fact that at the Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations is the person who wrote earlier the theory of moral sentiments, and that the two texts are deeply connected. Out of the instability and the material and social losses suffered by many across Europe in recent years is springing a demand for sustainable and secure models of socioeconomic development, which are accountable to elected governments, rather than being at the mercy of remote financial fluctuations or externalities, presented as being of something as almost a natural and near highly understandable kind. A kind of a flu in economic theory. If we are to construct a stable and prosperous future for our people based on sound foundations and avoid a replay of the errors of our recent past, then we must engage directly with those issues of ethics that have over time and for many and complex reasons become marginalized in our economic and fiscal discourse. One step, for example, towards a repeopled concept of economics would be to treat essential social goods, such as housing, health, and food, differently from other commodities in their relation to the market. All across Europe, the consequences of the economic crisis have been visited disproportionately on the poor and the marginalized, of those who, in the words of Jürgen Habermas, said, unlike the shareholders, they do not pay in money values, but in the hard currency of their daily existence. It is my conviction that we cannot effectively or even meaningfully address poverty in our communities without reflecting on the ethical questions that are posed to all of us and to our institutions by the unacceptable current levels of inequality. Inequalities that threaten to be transmitted from generation to generation with very serious consequences for our peaceful coexistence. Homelessness, then, is just one of the manifestations of this inequality, perhaps the most pressing of all in Ireland today, and one which I've sought to highlight through the past year. In this area, we see writ large the consequence of a commodification of social life and social goods, whereby policy has become separate from its ethical grounding in a conception of the fundamental requirements of the dignity of individuals and their families. I say this as we are honored by the presence in front of me of Brother Kevin, who does so much for the people to whom I refer. The ethical dimensions of such a social plight as homelessness, they're complex. They call for, at both individual and collective level, not just the impulse for charity as an immediate response in terms of policy design and policy choices. They need more. The current levels of inequality pose nothing less than a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of institutions and the morality of the state. The relevance of ethics in the social sphere is also immediately apparent in the area of work. We are challenged to interrogate current conceptions of the worker as being a mere unit of labor rather than a human being, an active citizen engaged in a range of activities and social relations. Any consideration of the ethical and social dimensions of work and the workplace must challenge such an atomized view of the individual. It requires us to see the worker and her productivity in her fullness as a citizen, connected to others through her family, her community, her participation in public or political endeavors, and living a full life which includes work, play, culture, spirituality, and study. Beyond the human community itself, climate change constitutes a threat to life on this planet and presents a compelling case for the impossibility of persisting with our current models of economic development or lifestyles we have recently acquired, those of us in the wealthier parts of the world. The ecological reality of our fragile planet exposes the fallacy of models of economics and endless growth, which ignore the human and environmental context in which goods are manufactured and traded. This challenge of marrying ecology, economy, and ethics can also be seen in the issue of farming, land use, global food production, and that great aspiration of providing nutrition to all of humanity without discrimination. And reminding ourselves, too, that if nutrition is to be a universal or global aim, it includes obesity in the developing world as well as malnutrition in the undeveloped world. In the sphere of the relations between peoples and nations, the contemporary historical moment is marked by changing forms of conflict and the rise of extremism in many regions, including the fringes of Europe. This calls for new modes of thinking, for a new practice of diplomacy, one that reaches beyond the narrow pursuit of national interests, for which we have paid too heavy a price already. This will entail the creation of new global institutions, accompanied by new agreements and perhaps even new systems of international law, as well as the restructuring of existing institutions. The last great moment of international institutional building, for example, was in the period immediately succeeding World War II. It was founded on a clear ethical bedrock, in that case, the drafting and approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Were the international community to succeed in the great tasks it currently faces in relation to conflict, shifting power relations, intolerance, climate change, migration, inequality, to name but a few, then we must once again ground its work in a strong ethical framework. And as we tackle all these great challenges which are public and political in nature, we must recognize that the very sphere of the political itself has been undergoing a very profound crisis over the last few decades, and that this has far-reaching consequences. Political participation itself is generally in decline across the Western world. There is now a widely shared realization that much of what has gone wrong and that has weakened and eroded our society has involved the alienation of political choices, such as those which I've just named, from the people affected. We've witnessed in public commentary, in the media, including the social media, in which so many people had hope, a reduction of issues that are crucial issues for our society to the status of merely technical problems, sometimes presented as the sole competence of experts and practitioners, drawn from a very narrow field, where very often context is ignored, theoretical assumptions are undeclared, and ethical reasoning bracketed off. In order to counter such a trend, we urgently need, I suggest, to develop among our citizens an engaging, inclusive economic literacy that will demystify what is too often, wrongly and for malpurposes, presented as being too complex for them to understand. Against that backdrop, the President's Ethics Initiative has aimed to stimulate the kind of intellectual reflection that might suggest new ways of tackling these challenges and identify opportunities for solutions. The initiative has sought to be, at its heart, a process and a discourse about democracy and empowered citizenship, about recapturing the public space so as to reinvigorate the discussions around the issues that matter most to our citizens. Now, very deliberately, this ethics initiative was not presented as a prescriptive enterprise, in that I did not seek to preempt the issues of the themes which should be addressed under it. Neither was it designed to come up with a single strategy for how any one set of values or views in society should be realized. Rather, it was about opening up a national discussion centered on values with the conviction that a richer national discourse, one that was grounded in ethical reasoning, could lead to better social outcomes, and that a more ethical society can indeed be fashioned by citizens joining together. To address what is really a crisis of legitimacy in our politics requires of us as citizens to claim and build a space for discussion in which everyone can participate. It has been widely welcomed, but it has also found itself, I have to say, in certain circumstances, having to force its way in and to create a space where such a reflection might be allowed. I have faced some disappointments in people, for example, who would have found it easier to have a celebratory lecture by a celebrity rather than the kind of discussion that I've been speaking about. And I was disappointed in that. Again, there were occasions where some people said, well, we have our corporate plan and it can't fit. This is one of the greatest obstacles facing Ireland at the present time. Making space for the new thinking that we need, the new ethical thinking that we need, and to do so dialogically and with tolerance. It requires citizens to be empowered, to be given the tools to participate effectively in that discussion, very particularly in the sphere of public economics, where we need no less, as I've already said, than a widely diffused campaign for economic literacy that facilitates democratic engagement with policy options, not just in their taking, but in their formation as options. It was my view at the time of my election as president, and this view has been affirmed during this ethics initiative, that if we embrace a deeper sense of critical examination, if we rekindle ethical thinking, Ireland can be seen as having taken advantage of being at the cusp of a radical transformation. But this requires being willing to take a bold step forward, a step of both an intellectual and practical kind. And rather than suggesting any despondency, I consider such a collective examination of ethics in our society to be an expression of hope and an effort to utilize the strong moral core at the heart of our community. The response to the ethics initiative at O levels has shown that there is indeed, across all sectors of Irish society, a great willingness to take on this task. I was very moved by Olivia's presentation of example at the railway station. But isn't it important as well that there are the likes of Olivia to describe it like this? And that is where we are. We are not the prisoner of past mistakes or events. The purpose of today's seminar is to reflect back on what we've learned through the past year, to discuss the steps that we've identified or might consider, so as to lay the foundations for an ethical society. My part of the President Ethics Initiative may be drawing to a close, but that's only a tiny part. All of yours runs on. Yes, we will prepare a final report in the coming months, but the seeds sown are the important ones too. They will, I hope, continue to take root and flourish into the future, as so many of them are already. So let us together then engage with today's national seminar as an opportunity for taking stock of the fruits of the initiative and also for looking to the future. Within the course of this day, we will hear from the different constituencies that have been part of the initiative, who will share their experience and reflections. The first panel this morning will be composed of representatives of some of the third-level institutions which have been most active in the initiative. And they most certainly have. They have just doing so much, and I thank them for it. These institutions form an important resource in the life of our community, and they have an essential role to play in helping us to address the challenges before us. I've said it already so often. I have described the crisis of recent years as being an intellectual crisis as well as an economic crisis. And it is then, I think, too, a moral crisis. If we recognize that the challenges of our time are intellectual in nature, we are forced to consider what role our public intellectuals and our institutions of learning have in supporting the building of a republic of ideas. And by inviting the various universities to play a leading role in the President's initiative, my intention was to assist in that process. There is an unashamedly intellectual dimension to the job of work that has to be done, and that is why the university sector, with its human capital and resources, was at the center of this initiative in its early stages. And it's at this stage that I'm asking again the heads of all of the third-level institutions to take the work of the initiative and put it on their agendas and discuss it, and to assist and recognize those members of the staff who have been working with me for the last year. That is my appeal to them today. The task of reimagining our society from an ethical perspective. It requires reflection, open debate, and the 60 events in the various universities, they've delivered a rich output. And I've been most impressed by the creative quality of what has taken place in the universities, the breadth of it, particularly the interdisciplinary emphasis of many of the events. There's been a great variety in the scale, form, and content of these different events. And interestingly, where the results were most positive, they were driven by those who were willing to give leadership on the project. And some of our academics did. Those who were willing to break down the barriers between disciplines, between institutions, and between the academy and the community. I had the feeling, too, which was interesting and worthy of reflection by the heads of universities, that often within the same institution, I was meeting academics who were taking the opportunity to become aware of each other's work and the work on ethics for the first time. The university events themselves have identified some main themes which set out a map of priorities for future action. Others, where heretofore consideration of ethics had been marginal. Among those who were identified, but not in a way that is exhaustive at all, the role and duties of the professional bodies and other stakeholders in society, the ethical challenges posed by emerging technologies in the social and biological area, the ethical questions raised by urban planning and the built environment, ethics in journalism and in the mass media, religion and public life, dialogical reasoning, housing, homelessness, direct provision, the role of the state in present conditions of economic, social, and political change, the growing gap between economic policy and the standards contained, for example, in treaties such as the revised European Social Charter. Which do you want? Do you want to say that the Charter doesn't matter, that it's there for dressing? Or do you want to take and implement it and put it at the core of your policies? The future of democracy in Europe and the fragility of the concept of union in the European political landscape. Human rights and their relevance to the social issues of our time. The nature of contemporary conflict and the related challenge of building peace. The position of the conscientious objector and the ethical issues arising. As we have an ethics of memory, mustn't we include also those who are conscientious objectors? There are, I think, therefore, I renew my invitation. I am happy to see that many of these academic endeavors and initiatives, they're continuing or they have inspired further, deeper projects. And I hope that the initiative will continue to inspire new connections, new collaborations between scholars and schools in the institutes and places of learning and education. We need a pluralist intellectual environment and an activism that is radical in its moral reach, informed as to diversity, research-based in an engaged manner, above all dialogical, and able to engage in a discourse in an open-ended way. For example, the need to break down disciplinary barriers, the need to become involved in public debate and in the media, the responsibility to serve equality through access to education at all levels. University College Cork has made particular efforts in this regard, which I want to especially acknowledge, through the establishment as a response to this initiative of a Centre for the Study of the Moral Foundations of Economy and Society, which I will be opening in May, and through interinstitutional collaboration with Waterford Institute of Technology. Several other institutions have advanced interdisciplinary cooperation internally, and I commend them for that and thank them for it. There can be no doubt that in some quarters, a utilitarian view of education as a commodity and as an instrument of economic policy has in recent years sought to assert itself, and it has been at the direct cost of academic integrity and academic freedom. Indeed, this has been the specific topic of some of the events that have taken place under this initiative, such as the workshop in critical pedagogy hosted by the University of Limerick. This is also an issue I addressed at the beginning of my presidency in a paper to the London School of Economics, and it is one that I've returned to on so many occasions since then. But I believe that the denigration of intellectualism in contemporary politics and policy formation is in fact one of the great ethical issues of our time in its own regard. At the level of the broader education system, we must also probe the deficiencies and weaknesses of a model of education that has become increasingly and excessively instrumental in focus, emphasizing a conception of the student as a future worker rather than as an active citizen. I referred in my earlier speech on ethics how our schools' curricula and pedagogical methods reflect the kind of humanity our society seeks and nurtures. The society we so dearly wish for will not take shape unless we acknowledge the need for an education of character and desires, the need to encourage and support critical reflection and a more holistic approach to knowledge. When I made that point with specific reference to the value of teaching philosophy in our schools, it also has a validity to the wider question of social and economic education. And I have not changed my mind on the enormous value it would be if we had philosophy at second level. When I think, too, bridging the gap between the academy and the community, in both its teaching practices and its research, is one of the questions facing that sector. And the Community Voices project, which has been initiated by a partnership between the University of Limerick, University College Cork, and Limerick Institute of Technology. This is a strong example of how this can be achieved, and I look forward to hearing more about the outcome from this university community project this afternoon, as we will all see, and also to participating in the World Cafe model, which Chris McInerney and his colleagues have developed. This is one of the many of the projects in the President's Initiative, which I'm pleased to say will continue beyond this period and will provide a future source of operation. Finally, Marfuckle Square. This afternoon we will hear from civic society organisations whose missions has always been intrinsically engaged in promoting values in our society and in our politics. To many there is nothing new in this, but it is worth restating that the community in the voluntary sector has always had its roots in an ethical worldview, in the decencies as they understood it, often based in the faith traditions or in the traditions of human rights and equality. And these are reconcilable. Civic society, that is the joint enterprise between groups of individuals around shared values and shared public objectives, is the lifeblood of a healthy community and a healthy nation. Participation in civic society in the public space is the opposite of individualism, atomization, isolation. The continuing vibrancy of this sector, despite the great challenges it has faced in recent years, is in itself an expression of how ethics and a concern for the dignity of others infuses the social action and the work of so many individuals and organizations, and shows how this work is cherished in our society. 5 national community and voluntary organizations have responded to the President's Ethics Initiative with their own projects and events, and you'll hear more about them this afternoon. The list of themes identified through the various events and activities is not exhaustive. It's just an example, but it does reflect some of the most pressing issues of our time. Work, decent work, addressing the issues of the precariat, the position of the worker, is the subject of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions Ethical Workplace Initiative, which is seeking workers' views on the relevance of ethics to contemporary labour. This is a theme I addressed myself in the Edward Phelan lecture to the ILO and the National University of Ireland in February. Poverty and equality was the theme of my address to the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's annual conference in September 2014. And the Society and the wider Vincentian movement responded by making the initiative the main focus for the work of the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice in 2015. The challenge of achieving equality and the protection of women's rights was the theme of a major international conference hosted by the National Women's Council of Ireland and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in February. Development, ecology and sustainability and our place in the world are the focus of the European Year of Development, which is being run in Ireland by DOCAS, which I addressed their launch event of the European Year for Development in January. The occasion of the centenary of 1916 inspired the Wheel to undertake a national consultation process entitled Community Voices, seeking to stimulate discussions about community values in a wide range of community settings, including the prisons and other closed settings. All of these projects will continue to generate ideas into the future and carry the idea of an ethical transformation more widely out into the community. The response to this initiative and to the University and Civic Society projects has demonstrated, yes, there is an appetite for further and deeper debate, and also for the project of rebuilding and renewing our society in a more ethical and sustainable way, one that will be inclusive. For all of this, for all of us then, this initiative must be seen, I would like it to be seen, as a call to action and a call to engagement and collaboration. And above all else, that much forgotten word, cooperation. In my first speech on the topic of ethics, where I mapped out a vision for this initiative in September 2013, I said that my presidency would seek to develop an ethical discourse that places human flourishing at the heart of public action. In my presidency, I have found that the framework of ethics has been a very useful mechanism in a coherent and consistent way. What I've been seeking to do, in addition to those areas named, is to bring an ethical perspective to the center of the presidency, such as in addressing the present decade of commemorations from the perspective of an ethics of memory, and also engaging with global affairs during my official visits to other countries, where I've sought to approach issues of development, climate change and human rights, from the perspective of human dignity and the ethics of sustainability and justice. As we begin our discussions today then, may I invite you all to join with me in an open-minded, open-hearted discussion with some joy, as well as critical capacity, about the principles and values by which we might build a better future for our people. I think this is a moment of great hope and possibility for Ireland. Gohfuil na féidireachtaí an for Ireland and our people. But that hope can only be fulfilled if bold changes are made in many aspects of our thought, our institutions, our action, the quality of our dialogue, as we approach the centenary of the founding visionary document of our nation. It is surely an ideal moment to set about this ambitious task. Garamila Mahaki, thank you.